them, and we need to drop them if needed. So all the things which are related to schema, the tables, creation of the things which is not considering the data will come into the DDL, data definition language. Why? Because we are all pointing to the definition. We are while creating the table, we are stating what are the columns of it, what are the data types of it. So whatever the things that we create, so it doesn't include the data. So all the definition things will come into the DDL. Okay. So what does the DML have? So we are not considering the data here, right? So now to play with the data, whether to insert it or update it or delete it. So this here we are playing with the data especially. So that is the reason the name itself says data manipulation language. Why? Because we are manipulating the language, whether we are inserting or deleting or updating. What is DCL? It says like data control language. So uh, at times we might have a requirement like based on some tables or views should not be accessible to everyone. So based on the criteria, we will give restricted access to particular logins or users. So to play with such type of permissions, to have the control on it, we use this language commands grant and revoke, to grant the permissions and revoke the permissions if not needed, so that we will have the control on the data. So that is all about TCL. TCL. So by default, the database, most of the relational database management systems, so the commit strategy would be auto commit by default. So if you don't use any transactional management commands, by default, whatever the actions that you do, like inserting the data or updating the data or deleting the data, which will be directly committed to the tables. Okay, but if there are some sequential entries that needs to be performed, and if you don't want to happen, if it got fails in between, if we want to reward the complete action, then we use the transactions there. So the TCL is all about the transaction control language. So for example, in instance, we want to insert data into multiple tables. For example, we do take an example of employee and employee skills. An employee can have multiple skills, right? So we can't have the skills column which can sit in employee table. So for sure, it will be two tables. One is employee and the other one is employee skill. And employee skill will have an referential entity, the foreign key to the employee table, to the employee ID. So what do we do is, like, if we are performing an insertion to the both the tables, but somehow if the insertion to the employee is successfully done, and for some reason the employee skill is getting failed, we don't want to have that halfway transaction. So if we want to revert it, what we will do is, like, we will begin the transaction and then we will insert into the employee, and then we will insert into the employee skill. If both the insertions are successful, then we will commit, or if we do have some failure in between the transaction, then we'll roll back, so that the halfway data will not be inserted. That is all about, like, TCL. And last but not least, the DQL, which is most and widely used in SQL, which has only one command, which is select. So to retrieve the data, we use DQL, the select. Any questions so far? Okay, here in none. Moving forward. Now we will jump on to the SQL Server. What is SQL Server? As we already seen, that SQL Server is an example of RDBMS, which is a relational database management system, relational database. So a SQL Server is an RDBMS database server built by Microsoft. Okay, and what are the different editions that are available in SQL Server? There are two paid versions, which are Standard and Enterprise, and there are two free versions, which is Express and Developer. There are some limitations for the Express, that few features are not available, and the summation of the storage could not exceed 10 GB, 10 gigabytes. So for the development of the lower environments which are not prod, or else, like, for some small applications, they will prefer Express. Okay, but if you need all the features and it should be equivalent to the enterprise edition, we'll prefer developer. Developer is the edition which is equivalent to enterprise, but the only condition is it should not be used for a production environment. Okay, for all the lower, and eventually what we do is like we will install developer for all the lower environments till the UAT or so. For prod we use standard or enterprise. That is what we do. Okay, so when it comes to the programming, for sure, based on the technologies, we'll have different IDEs, the integrated development environment, where we do have some graphical user interface, so that we can write some piece of code and do some executions, and compile the code and do some executions. SSMS is one of the IDE given from Microsoft. So, and for different databases, we'll have different graphical user interface, different IDEs. For SSM, for SQL Server, we use SSMS mostly. Okay, as we are here, before jumping on to the connection nodes, what we'll do is like firstly we'll see like how can we see whether a SQL Server is being installed in a machine or not. There are various ways that we can see whether the SQL Server is installed in a machine or not. We will see a couple ways, and we'll move on to the next. So one quick thing that we can do is we can go to the Windows app.cpl, where we can uninstall the programs. Here we can search for SQL Server. Here you can see that Microsoft SQL Server 2022 is the edition that has remained installed in this machine. This is one way of checking whether the SQL Server is being installed or not. And the other way is you can go to the SQL Server Configuration Manager. And here you can see all the instances. Right now I do only have one instance, which is a default instance, which is MS SQL Server. So it is in a running state. Okay, this is one way of checking whether SQL Server is being present on in this particular machine or not. And the one other way is yes, you can go to the services. I'm using the run command, or else you can even search for services in the start and open the services. Here you can search for SQL Server. See, this is a SQL Server which is in Windows service which is running. This also states that there is a SQL Server instance which is running on this machine. These are the three different ways that you can ensure that there is a SQL Server instance is being installed in a particular machine. Okay. To connect to a database server, we need to have there are various ways to connect to the database server. One is like Windows authentication. Second one is SQL Server authentication. Third one is like Azure Active Directory authentication. And again, like when it comes to the Azure Active Directory, there are a couple other split up options there, but right now we'll not be concentrating on Azure Active Directory authentication. Right now we'll only consider the Windows and SQL authentication. What does the SQL authentication, what does the Windows authentication make sure is like while setting up the database server, while installing it, we will select the mixed mode of authentication, which is Windows and SQL authentication. When we select the Windows authentication, we will add a particular Windows user so that he can be authorized and he can directly connect to the server without providing any user credentials like username and password. For example, right now I'm opening the SQL Server SSMS SQL Server Management Studio, which is an IDE. And I'll try to connect. See here, so the main entities like there are different when it comes to the SQL Server. Other than the database engine, there are something else like analytical services and some other integration services also. But again, like right now we are targeting for the SQL Server database entity, right? So for sure the server type should be database engine, and then the server. We need to provide the server name. If it is a if it is a remote server, we